Hello, everyone. I'm Michelle Berry, the Director of the Center for Innovation in Global Health. Thank you for joining us for today's Global Health conversation. It's my great pleasure to be introducing Dr. Peter Hotez. Dr. Hotez is an internationally recognized scientist, pediatrician, and global health advocate who has spent his career on the front lines of global health science and advocacy. As a leader in the field of vaccine development, his work couldn't be more timely or important. He's a constant voice on CNN, even Fox, MSNBC, telling the truth about COVID-19 and dispelling the myths from the anti-vax and anti-science movement. Peter is the Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine and Professor of Pediatrics and Molecular Virology at Baylor College of Medicine, where he's also the co-director of the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development. In this capacity, he leads a team and coordinates partnerships for developing new vaccines for numerous neglected tropical diseases, as well as SARS, MERS, and SARS-2 coronaviruses. Dr. Hotez, though, I have to say, as a colleague and friend, I think he really put the words neglected tropical diseases on the map. He coined it as NTDs and really spearheaded the effort to prevent and eliminate them. NTDs affect more than 1 billion people and are still neglected nowadays. More recently, and during this pandemic, Dr. Hotez has used his expertise and excellent communication skills to combat misinformation through various platforms. His leadership and effective communication has dispelled myths about COVID-19 vaccine, increased global access to the vaccine, and contributed to vaccine equity. In this era of misinformation, these are no small feats, but Peter never takes on small feats. He's like Don Quixote, in my opinion, but he gets there. In his most recent book, Preventing the Next Pandemic, Vaccine Diplomacy in a Time of Anti-Science, he outlines how we can avoid future catastrophic illnesses by expanding scientific knowledge and vaccine diplomacy. Welcome, Dr. Hotez, to Stanford.
Thank you, Michelle. And I was just thinking, we've known each other around for 30 years. You probably don't remember it, but you mentored me when I was a pediatric infectious disease fellow at Yale back in the Pleistocene era. So
that's right. When dinosaurs fought the earth.
The difference is I got old. You look the same. You look terrific and are as brilliant as ever. So it's a real honor to see you again.
And today we are joined by the fantastic communicator and interviewer, Paul Costello. Not all of you know, he's also quite a prominent actor in our area, but he will be leading our conversation. For 17 years, Paul served as a chief communications officer at Stanford Medicine, and then as senior communications strategist. Today, he serves as our senior communications advisor at the Center for Innovation in Global Health, and we're thrilled to have you lead the conversation. And now I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for those kind words. And Dr. Hotez, it's an honor to be with you today. And we're joined by, I think, nearly 400 people in the world of Zoom.
Wow.
And to that world out, it's great. A tribute to you and your proliferation on Zoom and on MSNBC, the cable networks that Michelle was talking about, and Twitter. I was just reading all your Twitter feeds this morning. I want to start with the stark data that was released earlier this week. As of Monday, the official global death toll for the coronavirus has passed 5 million, according to data from the Centers for Systems Science and Engineering at Johns Hopkins. And experts say that these numbers are actually an undercount, as some countries are unable to get an accurate picture, and others are probably hiding their data. Dr. Hotez, when you hear these dramatic numbers, 5 million dead, which is comparable to the size of Melbourne, Australia, or the nation of Singapore, what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, it's great to see you, Dr. Costello. I mean, I think, when I see the number, the first is, if only it were just 5 million. I mean, if you look at the Institute for Health Metrics numbers, they go up to 12 million potentially. And some people say there could be as many as 4 or 5 million deaths in India alone from their terrible Delta wave. So this has been a horrific human catastrophe. And so much of it could have been halted if we had the right governance, the right science policy. And this goes to show you why health policy, science policy is important stuff, because so many of those deaths could have been averted. And it also showed us how disease goes beyond health, right? It becomes it's potentially a security threat, an economic threat. It shows how the authoritarian regimes can cause so much human tragedy by the way they function, what happened last year in the United States, or what's still happening in Brazil, what happened in Russia, Duterte in the Philippines, and El Salvador. The list goes on, and contributing to that. And so this human tragedy will haunt our field of global health, but also the world for decades before we recover.
As you know, here in the United States, we're beginning, pushing out booster shots, and they are becoming widely available, and that's been criticized by the WHO. Did you see anything at the recent G20 meeting summit in Italy that accomplished anything significant as far as accelerating a concerted, effort, a global effort at attacking the virus?
Here's what I've not heard, and which is an honest accounting of the scope and magnitude of the problem to vaccinate the world. I mean, here's the back of the envelope calculation. We have a billion people in sub-Saharan Africa who are unvaccinated. We have roughly 700 million people in the Latin American Caribbean region. We have another billion and a half in the smaller low-income countries of Southeast Asia. That's 3 billion people. That means we need 9 billion doses of vaccines. And we now are realizing that, and I saw it early on based on our experience with our vaccine, there was never a plan to vaccinate 9 billion people. And it's not about sharing mRNA doses. I think that's where people get kind of hung up and don't quite understand what the problem is, in my opinion, that we've got 9 billion doses. There was never a plan to vaccinate the world with mRNA and adenovirus vectored vaccines, for the simple reason, as any engineer will tell you, and I'm sure at Stanford there are a lot of great engineers who will tell you, you can't go from 0 to 9 billion with a new technology anytime right away. So right now there's still no plan for that, because everybody was so focused on speed and innovation. I mean, that's all you heard out of Operation Warp Speed. It's pretty much what you heard about CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation. It was all about, we got to make a piece of mRNA and get to the clinic right away, and we're going to vaccinate people. And they did, but they only made enough vaccine for the Northern Hemisphere, and it left the South totally bereft of vaccine. And I know this for a fact, because I get a call every week from a minister of science or a minister of health from a low and middle income country or middle income country in the Southern Hemisphere. And they now realize those vaccines are not coming, and there was never a plan to do it because you can't scale it up. And so we're trying to fill that gap by our low-cost recombinant protein vaccine for COVID-19. And all of our vaccines that we make at our Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development are intended for global health. We use an older technology. In the case of our COVID vaccine, it's a recombinant protein made through microbial fermentation in yeast. Same technology used to make the hepatitis B vaccine, and there's no limit to the amount you can make. I mean, and we do this every year for hepatitis B, and it's made locally in many vaccine producers in low and middle income countries. And we knew this. We knew this from the beginning, and it was one of the great frustrations of my life. John Berman on CNN calls me a Cassandra, which I had to look up. It's she was fated to predict the future, but unable to get people to do anything about it. And this,
how does that make you feel, being Cassandra? What does that, someone calling you that, what does that make you, how do you feel about that?
Well, I'll accept the first part. I don't know if it's true that I could predict the future, but I don't accept that I can't do anything about it, because I'm still trying. That the beginning part of the pandemic was really tough because, because I have a daughter with autism and I wrote the book Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, becoming public enemy #1 with the anti-vaccine groups. I also became an expert in vaccine disinformation. So I was one of the first on the cable news networks to explain why what the Trump White House was doing was an anti-science disinformation campaign, not because I'm so brilliant, just because of my background and expertise. And I could smell an anti-science disinformation campaign a mile away. And I was, one of the first to call it out. So you mentioned Fox News, or Michelle did, and I was on Fox News, but that was about the end of it after that. Calling it a hoax or saying the hospital admissions were catch up in elective surgeries and hydroxychloroquine nonsense and all that. And that was tough, but equally tough was I was trying to raise money for our low-cost recombinant protein vaccine, and nobody had any interest in it.
Why is that?
Because it was all about speed and innovation. You can't, Peter, you can't get to the clinic fast enough. I said, I know, but it'll take a few extra months because it takes longer to scale up and make a recombinant protein under a quality umbrella than it does a piece of mRNA. But we're going to make up for the time on the back end because once you have it, then we could do the tech transfer and scale it up and make billions of doses. And no one cared. No, absolutely nobody cared about that. And so now we've done it. When I say we, our Center for Vaccine Development is co-headed by myself and Mary Elena Battazzi, my science partner for the last 20 years. And we've now transferred the technology and the production cell bank, no patents, to Biological E in India, where we actually helped with the co-development at our own cost. And now with Biopharma in Indonesia, and we're hopefully going to do about the same for Bangladesh. And basically I had to raise philanthropy on my own, private philanthropy. And it was a lot of Texas-based philanthropy. Tito's Vodka came through. They gave us $1 million. And so if you have based in Austin, if you have a vodka cocktail tonight, make sure it's Tito's Vodka. And the Clayburgh Foundation, Dunn Foundation, MD Anderson Foundation, and the JPB Foundation in New York, and a couple of other high net worth individuals. So we raised about $6.9 million, but that's what I was doing. And now it's going. So we're hoping that if all the stars align potentially by the end of this month, India will release the vaccine for emergency use. They call it Corbevax in India. It's being scaled to 100 million doses a month. The Indian government just did an advanced purchase of 300 million doses. And, it's thrilling to be able to make that difference. But, when you step back and think about it, our small research institute in Texas is doing more than the United States government or the G7 countries to vaccinate the world. And it's not that we're so great. It's just that everyone just we're unwilling to take this on. And we're so focused on the shiny new toys and the speed and innovation. And look, I'm an MD PhD scientist. I love innovation as much as the next person, but the huge mistake, there was never a good faith effort to, one, give a frank accounting to people that we had to produce 9 billion doses, and then to say, okay, here's the transparency, here's the Excel spreadsheet. We need 9 billion doses. This is what we can make with mRNA and adenovirus. Here's the gap. And how we're gonna now try to fill it with a recombinant protein vaccine that looks about as good as some of these others. And so we're doing it, but the really weird, bizarre thing is the lack of engagement from the US government, lack of engagement from the G7 countries. I mean, just total lack of intellectual curiosity even about it. And
what do you think accounts for that, the lack of curiosity about it? Is it, as you said, the exciting thing on the new kid on the block? What accounts for that?
Well, first of all, I don't know, but I think a piece of that was the belief that only the multinational companies could come through. Mm-hmm. And they're dismissive of the group that they call the Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturers Network. That's the actual name of the consortium of organizations, and very dismissive of academics. And the thinking was, and saying you have to have a patent, and this kind of, the fact that we were doing this with no patent and putting everything out in the public domain like we did, I think people were dismissive of that as well. But anyway, it's moving now. But I often think that had we had the same kind of support, or even half the level of support that the pharma companies had, we potentially could have had the world vaccinated by now.
Where are you on the question, the issue of breaking up the duopoly of Moderna and Pfizer and the power that they have over the mRNA vaccines? And one critic has said, I don't think we can accept this mantra of trade secrets being sacrosanct in a pandemic when so much of the risk has been taken by the public purse. What's your risk?
Right. I mean, clearly the sharing technology is important, and I support that. But you've got to remember that vaccines are, people kind of use the same story that where Cipla kind of helped break the back of the patents and started making antiretroviral drugs early on in the AIDS pandemic. It's very different with vaccines. Vaccines, even, you heard Meghan Markle and Prince Harry talk about, sharing, sharing the recipe, and all well-intentioned, but vaccines are different. Vaccines, the problem is not, quote, the recipe or the formula. It's scaling it up under a quality umbrella, quality control, quality assurance. That's where things break down. And it's not even building the factories. It's the human capital. It takes years to train people on how to, do the documentation through batch production records, quality control, quality assurance, to scale it up and make billions with integrity. And that's why, one of the reasons why we're not going to have mRNA vaccines, I don't think any time soon. And so, yes, we need to share the technology with the developing country vaccine manufacturers. We need new actors in this, not strict reliance on the multinationals. But that's for the next pandemic. If you're really talking about doing something about COVID-19 now, I believe it's vaccines like ours that could come in and vaccinate the world, and we have to. And so the exercise is we need 9 billion doses of vaccines, and we don't need it by 2023 or 2024. We need it now, and now we think we're ready to go. But again, Biological E has the capacity to produce a billion change, maybe Biopharma in Indonesia. And incidentally, the one Biopharma, they're also, hopefully it'll be a halal vaccine because it's a vegan vaccine, no animal cells or sources. But I want the Biden administration to take ownership of this in this sense and say, okay, now, Peter, we're going to get Merck and Company, which makes the hepatitis B vaccine, same technology as yours, scale up, make 4 billion doses. That's what needs to be done. But there's not that situational awareness and to do something like that, even though that's what needs to be done.
I want to ask you about one of the issues that you always opine upon, and that is anti-science. And you recently said we're no longer limited by biotechnology and science, and we're now limited by anti-science. And last week at the American Public Health Association conference, you said we have to stop being so feckless about all of this. It is not censorship, it is saving lives. And I take it from your statement that you think the anti-science movement is proliferating around the world because of complacency or because of timidness and taking it on and fighting it?
Yeah, I think so. Well, partly. So a couple of pieces to this. So again, early on, I was one of the fighters of the anti-vaccine movement because I have a daughter with autism, wrote the book about Rachel, and, and they started calling me the OG villain for that. So I had to look it up. It means the original gangster villain. So Michelle, you've invited the original gangster villain here to address Stanford University. And the problem, and I would start writing about it. I wrote, being here in Texas, it became the epicenter of the anti-vaccine movement because in order to re-energize, because I like to think myself and colleagues had sort of taken some of the steam out of the anti-vaccine groups by debunking the false claims about links with autism and explaining how autism, we have 100 genes involved in early fetal brain development, including we did whole exome sequencing with Rachel and my wife and I, and found a gene that was similar to the others. That had a big impact, but it took the steam out of the anti-vaccine group. So what they did to re-energize is they became a political movement, especially here in Texas. They glommed onto the Republican Tea Party and created a political action committee that started taking campaign contributions, incredibly enough, or political action money. And I started writing about it. I wrote a paper in PLOS and Texas and its measles epidemics. Then I wrote this article in the New York Times called "How the Anti-Vaxxers Are Winning," and I would get rebuked by federal agencies in Health and Human Services, and I won't name names, but they would say, Peter, we're not talking about this now because you're going to give it oxygen. I said, what do you mean you're going to give it oxygen? It's got all the oxygen it needs. These are not mom and pop groups. These are well organized political machines. They've got political money. They're monetizing the internet, selling fake nutritional supplements and books on Amazon. I mean, if you go to the books on vaccinations on Amazon, they're all, it's all mostly fake anti-vaccine COVID conspiracy groups. So I would argue with them. I said, you're talking like the American people. All they have are compact computers and dial-up modems and still use Ask Jeeves as their search engine. The world's changed, and so they wouldn't engage. And I said, this is going to have an incredible enabling effect. And there you go to the Cassandra part, right? So it sure enough, that's exactly what happened. And then in 2020, when COVID-19 hit, those same anti-vaccine groups, which had now become front and center of the Republican Tea Party as a major platform under this banner of what they called health freedom, medical freedom, that began in 2015 with the formation of the anti-vaccine PACs. Then what happened was they glommed on protests against masks and social distancing. So now this has become a full-on political movement. And it's a killer. I mean, a real killer. I mean, we've lost 90 to 100,000 Americans over the summer from this Delta variant who were unvaccinated, refused to be vaccinated despite the availability of safe and effective vaccines. So I don't even call it misinformation or disinformation anymore. I call it what it is. This is anti-science aggression. Some of it coming from the non-governmental groups, including what the Center for Countering Digital Hate. It's amazing we have to have an organization called the Center for Countering Digital Hate, run by my friend Imran Ahmed, calls the Disinformation Dozen. But I think the bigger player, though, is the political extremism on the far right. And you heard it from the CPAC conference earlier this year, that from members of the United States Congress saying vaccines are a political instrument of control, or they're going to come to your house and vaccinate you, and then they're going to take away your guns and your Bibles. And as ridiculous as that sounds to everyone, there's tens of millions of people who believe that garbage and therefore didn't get vaccinated as a sign of defiance and allegiance to the far right. And then you heard it amplified on the conservative news outlets at night, and you heard it on the Fox News nighttime anchors. And all of that led to 100,000 deaths by anti-science aggression. And so the point that I've been trying to make, and I've written a couple of essays in Nature and elsewhere, is say, look, in terms of, I'm not a political scientist. I'm a MD, PhD biochemist. I said, if you think about, all the things that we spend a lot of money in the United States government to put up infrastructure or go up against, like global terrorism or cyber attacks or nuclear proliferation. Hell, anti-science aggression is killing 10 times more Americans than any of those things combined. And yet we don't treat it as such, and we treat it as something that we're not allowed to take on. And now we're exporting this stuff. We're, Canada's never really had a strong anti-vaccine movement in modern history. And now you're seeing those same anti-vaccine protests earlier this in the summer in Vancouver and Ottawa, and elsewhere in Ontario. Same language, health freedom, medical freedom. So we've exported it to Canada. We're seeing anti-mask, anti-vaccine protests in the Western European capitals, and in Berlin and Paris and London. So we've created a monster now, and we've got to figure out how we're going to take this on.
What is the personal toll that this has all taken upon you and your family? As you said, you wrote the book, which was really brave, because I assume that you knew that this would become that there would become ferocious bite back. How do you deal with the personal toll of this vehemence, this anger, this hatred?
I think for me, the hardest part was, in medical school and graduate school, you get the message you're not supposed to talk about Republicans and Democrats and liberals and conservatives. We're supposed to be above all that. And it's not that I wanted to be political. It's just that I didn't know how to talk about it other than to talk about it. I'm not the one politicizing the vaccines. It's those guys. And I felt if I'm serious about saving lives, I've got to figure out a way to uncouple the anti-vaccine, anti-science aggression from the far-right element of the Republican Party. And as I say, I didn't know how to talk about it other than to talk about it. And this was the hardest thing I ever had to do. And I remember, back in the early part of the pandemic, I was mostly working from home, and and my wife was sitting on the sofa on the other side of the laptop with the cat, and she saw how upset I was getting. She's I can be unfiltered at times, and she's the one who's always holds me back, right? And then she said to me, Peter, you don't want to, and I get very emotional when I say this story, you don't want to look back on this 6 months from now and realize that you could have saved lives, but you didn't, because you didn't want to talk about Republicans and Democrats. And that's all I needed to hear. And I let it go and let it rip. And that's when I thought I knew what anti-vaccine aggression was. This was nothing, because now you were going up against this same elements that talk about stop the steal and all this other kind of stuff. And then the threats came. The army of patriots is going to hunt me down. And I said, well, I try to have some sense of humor. I said, I don't know why I need an army of patriots. It's just me, Rachel, me, Anne, Rachel, and the cat. I think one patriot's enough. Maybe two patriots. You don't need a whole army of patriots. And now we've had to bring in the Houston Police Department and a lot of anti-Semitism. I'm Jewish. A lot of anti-Semitism. A lot of Nazi. They love their Nazis. So a lot of Nazi images. A lot of Nuremberg hanging pictures. I don't know what the obsession with Nuremberg is all about, but then I got the Anti-Defamation League, helping me, and so this is tough stuff. But each time I've done this, I've said to myself, if I don't do it, who will? So when neglected tropical diseases got ignored in the early 2000s, when they were called the other diseases of the Millennium Development Goals, I said, I'm an MD PhD scientist studying parasitic diseases. If I don't do it, who will? And then it came up with Rachel and autism and all the crazy stuff that was being asserted about autism and vaccines. Again, if I didn't do it, who would? And I feel the same way about the anti-science aggression. I've been, it's the perfect storm of the fact that I've been adopted a coronavirus vaccine program 10 years ago, been making coronavirus vaccines, now a COVID-19 vaccines. I'm unfortunately, by default, the world's authority on the anti-vaccine movement and anti-science aggression. If I don't call it out, who will? And so that's what I'm doing. Without, a lot of it is without having a roadmap here. There's not a lot of precedent here to go on and to know where this is heading. But hopefully, the American people will understand that I'm doing all I can to save lives and be treated like that accordingly.
Let me ask you about your latest book, Preventing the Next Pandemic, Vaccine Diplomacy in a Time of Anti-Science, since we're talking about anti-science. For those who aren't familiar with the term vaccine diplomacy, can you give it some definition?
Yeah, it's kind of a working definition. I've been writing about it for 20 years now. And And I started writing about it when I got inspired when I learned about the story of Albert Sabin, who developed the oral polio vaccine uh, in Cincinnati Children's Hospital, and then got permission from the State Department to work with the Soviets at the height of the Cold War, right after the Sputnik launch. And the oral polio vaccine was first scaled up and tested in the USSR, after the Sputnik launch. And Dr. Chumakov, his counterpart, was two countries putting aside their ideologies to develop a life-saving vaccine that's helped eliminate polio globally. And I said, well, was there a modern precedent for the modern day example of that where we can try to reproduce it? And then I got the opportunity in the Obama administration. They had read some of the things I was writing and gave me the opportunity to do it in the Middle East and North Africa at a very tough time during the ISIS occupation and the Syrian civil war and the Yemen civil war. And it was very exciting to be able to build partnerships with countries in the Middle East and North Africa. And I still think it's the way to go. I think, we don't recognize the power of science and the power of science and technology as a beneficial diplomatic tool to reduce tensions. And one of the best examples was, and I wrote about it in the book, one of the things you do in Saudi is at night, in the evening, they have these things called diwaniyas where they separate the men and women, unfortunately, but you sit with men drinking coffee and tea. And I remember I was speaking at one of those one night on the same day that Trump, when he was running for office, President Trump said, all these terrible things about Muslims. And I was saying, oh crap, how am I gonna? And it was pretty well known. This was widely publicized. You could see it in the Saudi papers. How can I do this? How can I speak at one of these diwaniyas after a major presidential candidate such terrible things? And so the host of it saw that I was stumbling a bit and came up to me and he said, Peter, don't worry about it. Look, I know this is bullshit, quote unquote. I mean, he said, I did my PhD at Iowa State University. I lived in Ames, Iowa with a family. I know what the real America is like. And that's mic drop right there, right? I mean, that really said to me, wow, our greatest ambassadors are our universities and our universities professors. And this is why people still love America is because of what we stand for in terms of higher education, in terms of making life-saving interventions, technologies that change the world, but we don't know how to harness it very well. I think science diplomacy is probably the least developed, least shaped aspect of foreign policy, but yet I think it has the capacity to be among the most powerful. And when I did my exit interview for the U.S. Science Envoy program, I said, they said any recommendations? I said, yeah, multiply this times 100. We should be having all of our major professors as ambassadors of science. Informally, they kind of are, because almost everybody has international collaborations. But this is the side of America people want to see, what country would not benefit from the full power of Stanford University, right? And all of its expertise in so many areas.
In the book, you write about Viktor Zhdanov, I believe, his name, a virologist and Soviet deputy health minister during the 60s. And you called him a unsung hero of the global health movement. What was he able to accomplish that was so groundbreaking and extraordinary for those times? And are there any lessons here today to take from what he accomplished?
Well, I think what he did was he had, they were getting a lot of pushback from testing Sabin's vaccine in the USSR by mid-level officials in the Communist Party and the Kremlin. And he sort of cut through all the BS and had access to a special red phone where he could get immediate access to the top echelon of the Kremlin. And he had the courage to say, We have to do this, and that's all it took. And the person on the other end agreed, knowing and having the courage, knowing that if he was wrong, he was going to be most likely sent to a gulag or worse. And so tremendous courage there. And I think this is, one of the things I think we've seen with this COVID-19 pandemic in the scientific community. And, some have shown great courage in standing up to the anti-science aggression, others not so much.
Go back to, you talked about you began developing vaccines for poverty-related neglected diseases in the 80s, and they are some of the gravest global health threats that still exist in many nations throughout the world. What are some of the significant challenges to develop these vaccines, and where have you seen the most successes so far?
Well, for instance, our Schistosomiasis vaccine, which in the schistosomiasis is a disease of over 100 million people, including 40 million girls and women who live in poverty in Africa, produces this horrific condition called female genital schistosomiasis. It's a cause of pain, bleeding, social stigma. It's not so much a killer disease, but it's a cause of marital discord and grounds for spousal abandonment. And it's very tough on adolescent girls because that's when it peaks, and they get accused by, according to a colleague of mine, by community health workers of being sexually promiscuous when they're not. They get it by standing in contaminated water infected with Schistosome cerevisiae. Who makes that vaccine? I mean, it's the disease of the poorest of the poor. The answer is people don't. So that's what we're doing. We've developed now a vaccine in 2004 through an immunomics approach led by, this is back when I was at GW, by Alex Lucas, Jeff Bethany, and others. And we've came up with an exciting candidate molecule, but without having the financing to get it all the way through, that's been the tough part. So it's gone at a snail's pace compared to COVID-19. And even though it's a really exciting candidate, now it's going into phase 2 clinical trials, but we still don't have an end game for it because, to do a phase 3 clinical trials is probably going to be in the tens of millions of dollars. And it's not just a phase 3. We need an industrial scale manufacturer who's going to make it, because we can make it at the pilot scale in our labs in Texas and in collaboration with others. So we can get through up to phase 2. But now we're kind of stuck. We don't really know how to get it past phase 3 and into licensure without, not billions as many claim, but tens of millions. And this is why we need not only innovation in terms of the science, we need innovation in terms of the sustainable finance models. And so people, if I were giving this in person, this talk in person, I'd have a small line of young people coming up to me. Hey, Dr. Hotez, I'm all in. Want to go into this area. What should I do? And they're profoundly disappointed when I tell them to get an MBA or a law degree, because we need innovation in the finance sector and our legal framework. Yes, there are scientific hurdles, but equally daunting are the economic hurdles and the business models. And I think there's an answer there. I just don't have that skill set and background to know what it is. If we could turn the Stanford Business School, one of the finest business schools in the world, on this problem, I'm pretty confident we could probably sort it out.
What's the motivation that fires you up every day? What keeps you involved, keeps you doing the fight, keeps you, you as you said, faced great hurdles in financing for the vaccines that you're trying to develop, the anti-science movement, the personal attacks on you. What is the piece of you that fights it every day, that gets up and
for me, the reason I got, I've wanted to study parasitic diseases since I was in high school and worked in a lab in college at Yale, then went to Cornell and Rockefeller and started working on a hookworm vaccine as an MD PhD student. It was always I was always excited by science and the pursuit of humanitarian goals, that science has the capacity to do great things to improve quality of life and to ensure equity. And I still feel that way. And part of the inspiration also is I have a cousin who's now in his 90s. He's a rabbi in Bloomfield, Connecticut. He was a Holocaust survivor. I don't know if you remember there was an article in the New York Times a few months back on the Jews in the woods, how they, hid in the woods during in Poland, and they were protected by the partisans. He was one of those, and he taught me this concept of ancient Hebrew concept of tikkun olam, to repair the world, and it's a concept that's very old, but it ignited from Rabbi Isaac Luria, and who was one of the first Kabbalists, and who was the idea is sort of a semi-mystical concept that God deliberately did not finish the job so we could repair the world. It's kind of a poetic concept, and that stuck with me. So I've been writing and speaking about this half-baked concept I call science tikkun, and I have a paper just got accepted in FASEB Journal about it. So I'm excited about that that science has the ability to, I think, repair the world. And so going into areas where we can be impactful. And I actually think, although most scientists don't articulate it, I think most people go into science to do good. I think, that, but I think we need to frame it in a way to make scientists feel comfortable about it without sounding too squishy. And one of the things I say about science diplomacy, we call it soft power, and I make the comment, there's nothing soft about it. It's hard as nails if we use it in the right way. So
every day you're taking steps to repair the world.
That's the aspirational goal, anyway. And we'll see, if the other thing that's happened, but it's funny. I ran into my, at a conversation with my roommate from college, who actually did his MD PhD at Stanford, and now he's an important professor at Harvard Medical School, Matt Waldor, and he said to me the other day, Pete, back then they called me Pete, we knew you were going to be, a laboratory investigator. You're going to study parasites. I think what we didn't count on was, never saw coming, was the public engagement and the fire about, humanitarian pursuits. And I guess it took me a while to feel comfortable doing it. And the other new piece, and I always like to even though I'm 63 now, I like to convince myself I'm not too old to do new things. Started writing books when I came to Houston. You ordinarily don't think of people coming to Houston, Texas to start becoming a writer. But I think, before I was always in places like Washington, New York, and New Haven, where everybody's so brilliant, and coming here to Houston, Texas, I felt kind of liberated. And there is a pretty interesting literary community here in Houston. Started writing books, and that's become a new passion of mine. I love it. It's hard to get the time though between the day job of developing vaccines and the lab meetings and keeping up with the grants and the papers, and then fighting the anti-science aggression. Carving out time to write books is tough, but it's something I find very meaningful. And they're good. They're not great books, I think, but they're good books, and they're heartfelt, and young people seem to find some inspiration in them. And the last 3 were published by Johns Hopkins University Press, which I love working with them because they're very supportive, and they've helped make me into a better writer than I ever would have been on my own. And that's very meaningful to me.
Thank you for joining me, and thank you for the conversation. We're now going to take questions from our audience. The first one is, what is the impact of the COVID pandemic on surveillance and care services for neglected tropical diseases? How long will it take us at least to recover pre-COVID levels?
Yeah, no, it's an important question. In fact, I have an article that just came out in the American Journal of Tropical Medicine on this, because it was as a commentary for 2 articles about this. And I don't think we know the full impact. Clearly, there was a lot of disruption, social disruption from COVID-19, which included control programs. Interestingly, some of the ministries of health, and especially in Africa, really organized themselves very well to conduct mass drug treatment programs for neglected tropical diseases using safe practices. So I think more continued than we realize. But I think it'll take us a while to take full stock of how much we've lost because of COVID-19. I'm particularly worried about the childhood immunization programs. I mean, through the Gavi Alliance and WHO and UNICEF and the Gates Foundation, we've done such amazing work in terms of lowering the number of kids who die from measles, pertussis, and vaccine preventable diseases. And we know here in the US that there was a sharp decline during the social disruptions in 2020, and it's coming back up, but I'm worried that it's not going to get to baseline, and I'm worried it's not going to get back to baseline globally for quite a while. So we could see the return of measles epidemic. So I'm kind of holding my breath as we head into the winter, spring of next year, because historically that's when we saw big measles epidemics. On top of that, with all the anti-vaccine, anti-science aggression, I'm worried about a spillover effect, that it's not only going to having an impact on COVID-19 vaccines, but it's going to cause parents to question all childhood vaccines, so that we might not come up to baseline. And that's going to take a huge amount of, I hope it doesn't happen, but I fear it might in the United States and elsewhere globally, and that it's going to take a huge amount of vaccine advocacy to regain that ground lost.
That's a frightening concept.
Yeah, no, and we'll see. I don't think we have the full accounting. The Institute of Health Metrics, their global burden of disease study, the last one they did was 2019. So we'll see what the next one looks like. But I am worried that there is lost ground because of this, both because of the disruptions, but now because of all the anti-science aggression.
So another question, thousands of vaccine doses have been wasted in the US because of vaccine hesitancy. At the same time, low-income countries don't have nearly enough vaccines for their populations. What role do you see global diplomacy playing in this unequal spread of resources?
Yeah, and as we talked about before, I think, the US needs to commit to at least sharing a dose for every dose they give, either as a booster or whatever. But and again, we have to stop thinking this is a zero-sum game or fighting over a tiny piece of the pie. We have to make bigger pies, and we can do that. And making that commitment to, whether it's our vaccine or vaccines like it, we need that commitment to scale it up and scale it up now. We need to think of this like a Manhattan-style project, or really taking this on in a big way. But I've had great conversations with the leadership of the White House, and many of them I've known for years, and they've been good conversations. It just doesn't go that next step, and same with the G7.
Why doesn't it go that
so
next?
In other words, it's too much about a zero-sum game.
Mm-hmm.
Bickering about a handful of doses of mRNA vaccines, when in fact what we've got to do now is scale up and produce 9 billion doses of vaccines that will work probably just as well, but make it for the world now through other technologies.
Another question, there's an army of us countering vaccine misinformation on social media. How can we organize with public health officials, professionals, to be more effective? Do you see any movement out there that is seeking to really organize the disparate parts of the attacks?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've been on Zoom calls, as many of us have all last year, because we knew there was going to be a problem. And the message was, the conclusion of the call was always about amplifying the message, getting the message out there. And then I would always say, I said, this is fine. It will help. It will make a difference. I said, it'll get us maybe 20% of the way there, because no matter how much we do, we're going to be outgunned by the disinformation dozen or the political aggression on the far right. Now we have the Russian government. This has been documented by US and British intelligence, weaponizing health communication, using it to divide our democracy. So what we need to do is find a way to not just amplify our message, but to take down the anti-vaccine, anti-science aggression. And I wrote this in an essay in Nature, and it concludes by recommending, and a couple of papers I've written, the Biden administration should look at creating an interagency task force, and the UN should do the same, because I'm not sure I know what we can do. But there are people who do. It's the people who are fighting global terrorism and nuclear proliferation and cyber attacks, these big global threats. There are smart people who know how to do this, and to say, look, the health sector does not have the skill set or knowledge how to do it, but there are people in Homeland Security who do. There are people in the Justice Department, the Commerce Department, the State Department. Let's bring them together and find out what levers we can actually pull and push, and how to do it within a legal framework to launch a counteroffensive against this stuff. And the UN agencies need to do the same. I mean, the WHO has done a little bit. They've called it, fighting the infodemic, but it's very modest compared to what needs to be done. And recognize that this thing is no longer confined to the US. It's playing out in Canada, Western European capitals. We're now seeing in Africa, it's been documented now that the Putin government has been working to discredit what they see as competitor vaccines for Sputnik V. This is unacceptable, and we need to start taking this down if we're serious about saving lives.
You've mentioned the WHO a number of times, and I wonder what you think of the criticism of these global health organizations, kovacs, WHO. Are they too bureaucratic? Are they not nimble enough during this pandemic?
Well, with kovacs, I think it's an excellent mechanism for sharing. The problem is the vaccines aren't there to share. So the failure is not so much with kovacs. It was an upstream science policy failure, so focused on innovation and speed at the expense of what could be made at scale. So I kind of give kovacs partly a free pass on that one. With the World Health Organization, I say, remember what we're asking the World Health Organization to do. We're asking them to be kind of the CDC for the world at a budget that's a fraction of what the CDC gets. And we've just not been willing to invest the resources that we need to. So WHO is not perfect. Neither has been, and no organization has been. But in balance, I think they do what they can with very modest and limited resources, and we have to remember that.
Your point about how failing to address anti-scientific aggression helps enable it resonated with me. This person says strongly, I'd love to hear your thoughts on medical professionals and other scientists who have been helping stoke this through false, misleading claims, and how we should deal with it within our own institutions.
Yeah, no, this has been really demoralizing, right? And this is the other piece of aggression coming from the far right. It's, okay, you have members of Congress, going after science and actually going after scientists. You have the conservative news outlets. I had, the other night I had Laura Ingraham with Governor DeSantis on Fox News going after me. And I got a call from a friend, hey, turn on Fox News. I said, why? No, just turn it on. And there's Laura Ingraham and the governor of Florida going after me. I'm looking at this. I'm not even from Florida. I mean, I took the kids to Disney World once, and when they were little, but so that's really bad. But the other piece to this, other than the members of Congress and the red state governors, has been this cultivation of a cadre of whatever you want to call them, counter-intellectuals, counter-pseudo-intellectuals, coming out of conservative think tanks in many cases, and professors coming out of top universities, putting out absolute garbage in terms of the science and taking accurate facts and factoids, but turning it around to twist it in this false narrative. And that's been really disheartening. So I've been trying to understand that space, and now I'm starting to kind of get it. And the light bulb went off. I found this paper that was written in 1941. It was called Science in the Totalitarian State, and it was written by at that time he was the science writer of the New York Times, although he wrote it in Foreign Affairs. And I'm reading this, and I said, "This sounds familiar." And then I realized this is, and then I read Anna Applebaum's book on authoritarianism, and I said, where she talks about how Orban, doesn't dismantle the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. He replaces the Hungarian Academy of Scientists with a similar type of contrarian intellectuals, and this is what's happening. So this is all part of a larger authoritarian attempt, in which includes seeking to discredit science and discrediting scientists, and it goes back to the 1930s and 40s when with Stalin, took aside Vavilov and inserted Lysenko to practice vernalization instead of appropriate agricultural practices, and targeted scientists. Now, we're not sending scientists to gulags anymore, but that's the other piece to all of this, is they're targeting prominent scientists. So they go after Fauci, of course, Tony, and they go after me and others, and that's very chilling to see that play out as well. So I am really concerned about that we have to be able to discuss it, call it out, because I just think it's so dangerous, and dangerous to our democracy as well.
Where do you think we'll be a year from now, if you looked into your crystal ball?
Well, I'm hoping that we can still do better at vaccinating the American people and vaccinating globally. I think that's the big unknown. I'm on the optimistic side that says we can stop the pandemic, but the bar is high. We're going to have to vaccinate billions and billions of people with good quality vaccines. It's probably going to need 3 doses of mRNA vaccines and 2 of some of the others. And so technically it's doable. Whether there's the political will to do it, I don't know. Otherwise, looking at some of the models of what'll happen is, if you look at some of Mark Lipsich's models at Harvard, showing these seasonal peaks in the winter, like other upper respiratory coronaviruses, maybe peaks in the warmer climates in the south, like we've seen the last 2 summers here in Texas. And I think if that happens globally, and especially if things catch fire in places like Africa, I think we're in for a period of great instability. And I worry that this aggression from the far right, will perpetuate this kind of dystopia that we're currently in. So I think getting the pandemic under control is going to be critically important, not only for the health of the world, but for the political stability and to prevent authoritarian regimes from gaining ascendancy. And it's been happening in the U.S. It's happened in Brazil. It's happened in Hungary. It's going to happen elsewhere as well, and that would be tragic given how much progress we've made.
Let me thank you for all that you do. I'll close with that and hand it back to Dr. Berry. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate it.
I want to thank Paul for another thoughtful and deep interview. And Peter, I want to thank you for your large vision and your ability to put it within historical context, your strong voice and advocacy for science. And I also want to commend you on your ability to communicate with such empathy. I think it makes you a great ambassador for science, and we need you. So thank you very much for coming to Stanford. And I hope we have another conversation next quarter that we have as many people attend.
Thank you, Michelle.
I don't know if we'll get someone as big a star as you, Peter.
Well, usually I find my way to Stanford to give a talk once every year, a couple of years, and I always get rejuvenated when I come there. It's such a extraordinary place. So hopefully after this apocalypse finally closes down, you'll invite me again invite me again to Stanford, and I'd look forward to seeing many friends and colleagues.
Take care. Be well.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.